Imagine a world tucked away from the relentless noise of modernity. A place where the rhythm of life is dictated by the sun and seasons, not the ticking of a clock. Here, hands, calloused and capable, build homes from raw timber and bake bread in wood-fired ovens, its scent a warm promise drifting through the air. Children, dressed in simple, earth-toned linen, run through fields of tall grass, their laughter echoing in the clean, crisp air, unburdened by the digital glow of screens. It is a portrait of perfect harmony, a meticulously crafted return to a life of tangible purpose and deep community, a sanctuary far from the perceived chaos and corruption of the outside world. This is the promise of the 12 tribes, a living, breathing ark in a world drowning in its own excess. They offer a simple trade, your old life with its anxieties and loneliness, for a new one filled with belonging, meaning, and the certainty of salvation. But look closer. Past the warm smiles offered to outsiders at their roadside cafes and organic markets. Look into the eyes of the children. There is a stillness there, a quiet watchfulness that seems older than their years. Notice the uniformity, not just in dress, but in posture, in the rehearsed cadence of their speech. It's a community that moves as one body, a beautiful, synchronized dance of devotion. Yet, in any perfect picture, the slightest imperfection draws the eye. A flicker of hesitation, a glance that is held a moment too long, a silence that falls too quickly when an unexpected question is asked. These are the subtle cracks in the facade, hints of a foundation built on something more rigid, more unyielding than simple faith. And if one listens closely enough, past the gentle folk music and the murmur of prayer, a different sound can be heard. It is not a loud sound. It is sharp, thin, and methodical. It is the sound of a thin, flexible rod, often no thicker than a pencil, striking the skin of a child. It is followed not by a scream, for screaming is forbidden, but by a choked sob, quickly suppressed. This is the sound of the rod of correction, the cornerstone of their discipline, applied for infractions as small as a moment of daydreaming or a misplaced toy. It is the sound of silent obedience, born not of peaceful understanding, but of a deeply ingrained fear. It is the sound of a world where a child's will is not something to be guided, but something to be broken. This is the hidden curriculum of the 12 tribes. For decades, this global religious movement has presented itself as a sanctuary, a living reenactment of the first Christian church, untainted by the sins of society. But for those who have managed to escape its embrace, it was a gilded cage, its bars forged from love and fear in equal measure. The walls of their communities are not always physical. The most powerful fences are the ones built inside the mind. The belief that the outside world is a place of pure damnation, that to leave the community is to abandon God and condemn one's soul to eternal torment. Individuality is a sin. Questioning is a sign of rebellion. The world they have built is not just separate, it is a fortress designed to keep the world out and its people in. What is the true price of this total belonging? What happens to the human spirit when it is pruned and shaped from birth to fit a single, unchangeable mold? Tonight, we pull back the heavy curtain of secrecy that has shrouded one of the most insular and controversial communities of our time. We will listen to the stories of those who paid the price, who sacrificed their identity for a promise of utopia, only to find themselves in a silent dystopia. We will examine the complex line between religious freedom and fundamental human rights and ask a question that echoes far beyond the borders of these isolated farms. Where does faith end and absolute control begin? To understand the 12 tribes, we must first travel back in time to an America fractured by war and social upheaval. The early 1970s were a crucible of discontent. The vibrant colors of the summer of love had faded into a grim, disillusioned gray. The idealism of the 60s had soured, leaving a generation adrift in a sea of uncertainty, haunted by the ghosts of assassinations and the endless televised horror of the Vietnam War. At home, trust in traditional institutions was eroding like a coastline against a relentless tide. Family, government, and the established church seemed to be failing, their promises ringing hollow in the ears of a youth that craved authenticity above all else. This was the fertile, chaotic soil from which countless new movements grew, each offering a different map out of the wilderness. Communes sprang up in rural landscapes, promising a return to the earth and a life of simple, shared labor. Eastern philosophies offered new paths to enlightenment, away from the perceived materialism of the West. It was within this larger cultural tremor, often called the Jesus movement, that a unique and potent vision began to take shape. In this vacuum of meaning, a generation of young people was searching desperately for something real, something to anchor their lives to, a truth that could not be shaken. Into this landscape stepped a man who mirrored the anxieties of his time, a former carnival barker and high school guidance counselor from Chattanooga, Tennessee, named Gene Spriggs. He was a figure of compelling contradictions, a man with the persuasive charisma to sell fantasies to a crowd, yet also the earnest desire to guide lost souls. Into this landscape stepped a man who mirrored the anxieties of his time, a former carnival barker and high school guidance counselor from Chattanooga, Tennessee, named Gene Spriggs. He was a figure of compelling contradictions, a man with the persuasive charisma to sell fantasies to a crowd, yet also the earnest desire to guide lost souls. Into this landscape stepped a man who mirrored the anxieties of his time, a former carnival barker and high school guidance counselor from Chattanooga, Tennessee, named Gene Spriggs. He was a figure of compelling contradictions, a man with the persuasive charisma to sell fantasies to a crowd, yet also the earnest desire to guide lost souls. He too was a seeker, a restless spirit who had sampled the world's offerings and found them all wanting. He had journeyed through mainstream Christianity and found it lukewarm, compromised by the very society he sought to escape. His search drove him deep into the scriptures, where he believed he had unearthed a forgotten blueprint, the pure, unadulterated lifestyle of the first-century church. In 1972, this vision found its physical form. Spriggs and his wife Marcia opened a small coffee shop called the Light Brigade. It was more than a business, it was a sanctuary, a lighthouse for the shipwrecked. Here, amidst the aroma of brewing coffee and fresh-baked bread, a new kind of family was being forged. Young drifters, disillusioned students, and weary hippies found not just a free meal, but a radical sense of belonging. The message, delivered by Spriggs with magnetic certainty, was intoxicatingly simple. The world outside, the system, is corrupt and dying. The only salvation is to abandon it completely. Sell your possessions, sever ties with your past, and join a new, holy family where everything is shared and every soul has a divine purpose. There were no gray areas, only the pure, unfiltered light of a rediscovered faith. It was a vision of utopia, built on the ashes of a broken world. But this is only the first layer of the story, because within that simple, beautiful promise of community and purity, a framework of absolute authority was already being constructed, brick by silent brick. The seeds of total obedience were planted in the most genuine soil of spiritual seeking, and what would grow from them would be far more complex and far more isolating than any of those early followers could have ever imagined. The architect of this unseen structure was a man named Elbert Spriggs, a former carnival barker turned high school guidance counselor who, in the early 1970s, underwent a profound transformation. The architect of this unseen structure was a man named Elbert Spriggs, a former carnival barker turned high school guidance counselor who, in the early 1970s, underwent a profound transformation. He shed his old identity and adopted a new name, Yonek. This was more than a rebranding. It was the birth of a prophet. Spriggs possessed a rare combination of skills: the showman's charisma to capture a crowd's imagination, and the counselor's intuition to identify the deep-seated anxieties of those searching for meaning. His vision was not merely to start another church in an era of spiritual experimentation, but to perform a radical act of historical restoration. He believed modern Christianity was a failed, diluted project, and the only solution was to rewind the clock 2,000 years. His mission was to rebuild the 12 tribes of Israel, not as a metaphor, but as a literal, breathing nation living within the shell of the modern world, a holy enclave sealed off from the corruption of what they called the world system. The price of citizenship in this new sacred kingdom was absolute, and the transaction was designed to be irreversible. To join, one had to perform a profound act of severance from their former life. It began with the material world. Followers were taught that private ownership was the very root of selfishness, a symptom of a fallen world. The keys to their homes, the titles to their cars, the deeds to their land, the balances in their bank accounts, all were to be surrendered to the collective. This was not framed as a loss, but as a glorious liberation from the chains of materialism and the anxieties of modern life. But in practice, it was the first and most critical step in forging total dependency. By systematically dissolving their past financial lives, new members were left with no safety net, no resources, no path of retreat. The community became their sole provider, their only material reality. To leave would mean to step into the world with nothing. This principle of surrender, however, went far deeper than money. It was a meticulous psychological and spiritual reprogramming. Old relationships, particularly with family who remained outside the group, were systematically redefined as spiritual dangers, tethers to a sinful past. Attachments to former careers, personal ambitions, or even individual opinions were labeled as forms of pride that had to be put to death on a spiritual altar. The individual ego was the enemy, a disease to be eradicated. It was to be dismantled piece by piece and replaced with a collective consciousness, a single mind directed by the group's elders, with Yonak at the apex. His teachings, distributed in a series of writings known as the Papers, became the ultimate source of truth. They were not suggestions, they were the new law, interpreting scripture and dictating every facet of daily life, from diet and dress to marriage and child-rearing. This was the true origin, not a spontaneous spiritual movement, but the deliberate construction of a system where belonging was purchased with the currency of self, creating a closed loop of belief and obedience from which escape would become almost unthinkable. But what happened next is even more surprising. For a time, this self-contained world existed in the quiet margins of society, a collection of agrarian communities that seemed harmless, if eccentric, to outsiders. They ran businesses that became local fixtures, the yellow deli cafes, organic farms, and skilled construction companies, all presenting a public face of wholesome collective industry and handmade simplicity. This carefully curated image of pastoral harmony, however, was a veil. Behind it, within the communal homes where privacy was a foreign concept, the doctrines of absolute obedience were being forged into the very bones of a new generation. The children, born into this reality, knew no other. Their world was a closed loop of constant labor, scripture memorization, and swift, uncompromising discipline. The instrument of this training was often a thin, flexible balloon stick or reed-like rod, chosen not to break the skin, but to inflict a sharp, stinging pain that bypassed physical injury and went straight to the will. This practice, rooted in their literal interpretation of biblical proverbs, was framed as an act of profound love, a sacred duty to save a child's soul from the damnation of individualism. But secrets kept in a closed society eventually seeped through the cracks. Whispers began to surface, carried by the few who had managed to leave or by desperate relatives who had lost all contact. They spoke of children working long hours in the group's factories, of a deliberate lack of formal education beyond their own teachings, and of a pervasive fear that governed every interaction. This practice, rooted in their literal interpretation of biblical proverbs, was framed as an act of profound love, a sacred duty to save a child's soul from the damnation of individualism. But secrets kept in a closed society eventually seeped through the cracks. Whispers began to surface, carried by the few who had managed to leave or by desperate relatives who had lost all contact. They spoke of children working long hours in the group's factories, of a deliberate lack of formal education beyond their own teachings, and of a pervasive fear that governed every interaction. The breaking point arrived in the pre-dawn darkness of June 22, 1984, a date now etched into the group's mythology. In the quiet town of Island Pond, Vermont, a massive, coordinated force of state troopers and social workers descended upon the community. Acting on a warrant fueled by allegations from a former elder, they raided the compound with the intention of taking all 112 children into protective custody to examine them for signs of systemic abuse. The scene was one of controlled, surreal chaos. The community, awakened from sleep, responded not with panic, but with a practiced passive resistance. They sang hymns as their children were carried away, their faces a stoic mask of fear and defiant faith. The raid was meant to be a decisive intervention, a rescue mission. Instead, it became a legal and public relations catastrophe for the state. In court, a judge ruled the raid unconstitutional, stating that the state's blanket warrant had violated the group's rights. They had not provided sufficient evidence of abuse for each individual child before seizing all of them. The children were returned. For the 12 tribes, the outcome was interpreted as nothing less than a miracle, a divine vindication. It was proof that the world was exactly as Yonek had described it, a hostile, godless entity seeking to destroy their righteous way of life. The raid did not break them, it galvanized them. It became their foundational myth of persecution, a story told to every new member and every child born within the faith. It reinforced their isolation, justified the tightening of their control, and taught them how to fight back, not with violence, but with sophisticated legal strategy and a powerful narrative of religious martyrdom. The walls around their community grew higher, not with bricks, but with a righteous fear of the world outside. Here begins the darkest part of the story. Emboldened by their legal victory, the 12 tribes began a quiet, methodical expansion. The Island Pond raid had been a lesson, not in compassion, but in strategy. They learned to navigate the legal systems of the world, to present a polished public face, and to fortify their internal structures against scrutiny. The movement spread like spores, first across the United States and then globally, planting communities built on the same blueprint of communal living and absolute loyalty to Yonek. Their network of businesses grew in tandem. The Yellow Deli cafes, with their rustic charm, became the public-facing embassies of their world, offering a taste of a simpler life. But this economic engine, funding their global expansion, ran on a hidden fuel, the complete and unpaid labor of every man, woman, and child. Within the tribes, work was not a job, it was worship. Children from a young age were integrated into this workforce as disciples in training. They could be found working long hours in the fields, sanding wood in construction businesses, or helping in the kitchens of the cafes. The group defended this as essential spiritual education, a way to build character and avoid worldly corruption. But investigators and former members described a different reality, a system of child labor that deprived children of a standard education and a childhood itself, all for the economic benefit of the collective. But the darkness ran deeper than labor practices. As the group matured, its ideology solidified into a rigid and disturbing shape. Yonek's writings, revered as divine revelation, laid out a worldview fundamentally hostile to modern society. They contained teachings that praised the institution of slavery as a biblical model of order and submission. They taught that the civil rights movement was an act of rebellion against God's established order. These were not fringe opinions, but core doctrines, taught to children as absolute truth, creating a generation raised to believe that racial inequality was a divine design. This theological framework justified a level of control that was absolute, dismantling the very idea of individual rights and replacing it with the singular duty of submission. This dark escalation reached a chilling echo decades later in Bavaria, Germany. In 2013, authorities raided 2 communities after an undercover journalist captured irrefutable video footage, children being systematically and repeatedly beaten with rods for minor infractions. The images were cold and devastating. Once again, the 12 tribes fought back in the courts, decrying religious persecution. But the visual proof was too powerful to be dismissed. The German courts upheld the removal of the children, ruling that this chastisement was a calculated, soul-breaking practice that constituted child abuse. The incident in Germany proved that Island Pond was not an anomaly. It was the system working as designed. The escalation had been successful. The group had created a global, self-sustaining organism, adept at defending itself and perpetuating its beliefs, leaving a trail of broken families and psychological scars in its wake. Today, the 12 tribes exist in a strange paradox. They are at once more visible and more opaque than ever before. Their yellow deli cafes and common ground bakeries can be found in towns across North America, Europe, and South America, serving organic food with a gentle communitarian smile. To the average customer, they are a charming throwback, a glimpse into a simpler, more connected way of life, filled with the scent of baking bread and the warmth of handcrafted wood. But this public-facing enterprise is merely the skin of a much more complex and resilient organism. It is a carefully maintained facade, behind which exists an unseen architecture of control. The consequence of this decades-long project is a legacy of quiet, internal damage, passed down through generations like a grim inheritance. For those born inside, the world is a meticulously constructed reality tunnel. Education is limited to what the group deems necessary for service within the community, creating a deliberate intellectual and practical dependency. They are taught how to farm, how to build, how to serve, but not how to question. A young adult leaving the group might not know how to write a resume, open a bank account, or navigate the complex social codes of a society they've been told is irredeemably corrupt. Critical thinking is not just discouraged, it is identified as a spiritual sin, a form of rebellion against God's appointed authority. The fear of the outside world, or the world as they call it, is a foundational pillar of their psychology. It is portrayed as a chaotic, predatory landscape of moral decay, a place where they would be spiritually and emotionally devoured. This makes the very thought of leaving an act of profound terror. Escaping the 12 tribes is not just leaving a home, it is stepping out of the only known reality, a self-inflicted excommunication from the only God they know. It is a choice framed as one between communal salvation and solitary damnation. But the digital age has introduced an unpredictable variable into this closed system. The internet, the very symbol of the interconnected world the tribes reject, has become a lifeline for those who escape and a battleground for the group's narrative. On one side, their official websites present a curated gallery of communal bliss. On the other, in the unlit corners of online forums and social media groups, a digital sanctuary has emerged for ex-members. Here, stories of beatings, of lost childhoods, of families torn apart by doctrine are pieced together, forming a mosaic of trauma that directly counters the group's serene public image. This online counter-narrative has made it harder for the tribes to operate in the shadows, but their core structure remains largely impervious. They continue to thrive in the legal gray areas of religious freedom, often presenting themselves as a persecuted minority when confronted with allegations of abuse. The machine built by Yonek was designed to outlive him, and it has. It is a closed-loop economy fueled by faith and free labor, a system where the profits from a cup of coffee served with a smile are inextricably linked to the unseen tears of a child disciplined in the dark, ensuring that the cycle of control is passed down from one generation to the next. Consider the story of a young man we will call Simon. He was not a convert who chose this life. He was a product of it, born into the truth of the 12 tribes as one is born into the air they breathe. His world was circumscribed by the scent of sawdust in the workshop and the damp earth of the fields. His hands, from the age of 5, were never idle. They learned the rhythm of sanding wood for the community's furniture business, the patience of weeding endless rows of vegetables, and the sharp, familiar sting of the rod for a moment of distraction or a question deemed impertinent. His mind was a carefully cultivated garden, planted only with seeds of scripture and Yonek's teachings. The world outside was not a place of possibility, but a dark story told around the communal dinner table, a chaotic sea of sin from which he had been mercifully saved. His moment of rupture was not a dramatic rebellion, but a quiet, accidental discovery. While cleaning a van used for the group's business, his fingers brushed against something wedged under a seat, a small, tattered paperback book left behind by a customer. It was a simple novel, a story about people who made their own choices, who loved and failed and lived in a world governed by chance and personal will, not by a council of elders. He read it in secret, in stolen moments in a dark corner of the barn, the words a strange and dangerous music in the enforced silence of his disciplined mind. The characters in the book had private thoughts. They made mistakes without being publicly shamed. They owned things that were just theirs. For the first time, he felt the terrifying gravity of a question he didn't know he was allowed to ask. What if there was another way to be? The thought was both a poison and a key. For months, he lived a double life. By day, he was the obedient son, the diligent worker, his face a mask of conformity. By night, his mind was a battlefield, tormented by the ghost of a world he couldn't imagine but could no longer ignore. He felt a gnawing guilt, as if the book itself had infected his soul. To leave was to become an orphan, to willingly step into the damnation he'd been warned of his entire life. It meant losing his mother, his father, his siblings, everyone he had ever known, who would now see him as a lost soul, an apostate to be mourned and shunned. One moonless night, with nothing but a few dollars he had secretly saved and the forbidden book in his pocket, he walked away. He did not run. He simply walked down the long dirt road, every crunch of gravel under his feet a deafening betrayal. He passed the sleeping houses, the silent workshops, until the familiar lights of the communal house were just a faint, accusing glow behind him. The freedom he met was not glorious. It was a cold, silent void. He stood at a 24-hour gas station, paralyzed by the simple act of buying a bottle of water, unfamiliar with the casual dance of commerce and the bored look on the cashier's face. The world did not feel evil as he'd been taught. It felt impossibly complex and crushingly indifferent. The greatest walls were not the ones he had left behind, but the ones he now carried inside him. A deep-seated fear of damnation, a profound ignorance of social codes, and a loneliness so complete it felt like a physical weight. The crushing price of a life he now had to learn to build from the rubble of the one that had been built for him. His story, and countless others like it, forces us to confront a disquieting and fundamental question. At what point does a community, built on the promise of spiritual purity and a refuge from a broken world, become a cage? The 12 tribes offer a seductive answer to the chaos and alienation of modern life. A simple, ordered existence where every question is answered and every action is preordained by divine will. It is a promise of belonging, of purpose, in a world that often feels purposeless. But this simplicity, this beautiful and tranquil certainty, comes at a cost paid in the currency of individual thought, personal ambition, and the sacred, terrifying freedom to choose one's own path. The narrative of the 12 tribes is a stark and chilling illustration of how the noble search for a perfect world can lead to the creation of an imperfect prison. It reveals that control, even when cloaked in the gentle language of love, community, and salvation, ultimately erodes the very essence of what it means to be human. The right to doubt, the courage to dissent, and the arduous journey to discover one's own truth. The physical and emotional scars left on those who leave are not mere side effects of a strict lifestyle. They are the intended outcome of a system designed to break the will. They are a testament to the fact that a system demanding total obedience does not create saints. It creates survivors, individuals who must learn to navigate the world with a compass that was deliberately shattered. This is not just a story about a single, isolated organization. It is a mirror reflecting a timeless and deeply human struggle, the eternal tension between the safety of the collective and the sovereignty of the self. It asks us to consider where the line is drawn between religious freedom, a cherished principle, and the fundamental human rights that must protect the vulnerable from its excesses. This question becomes most urgent when we consider the children, born into a covenant they did not choose, raised under a rod they cannot escape. Their minds are the territory where this battle is most fiercely waged, their futures the price of a community's vision. Perhaps the most profound and unsettling lesson from the history of the 12 tribes is that the most formidable prisons are not built of stone and steel, but of belief and belonging. The gilded cage is all the more effective because its bars are invisible, forged in the heart and mind. Any utopia that requires the silencing of a child's questions, the sacrifice of an individual's conscience, or the fear of the outside world to maintain its integrity is not a paradise at all. It is a monument to fear, a fragile kingdom whose walls must be constantly guarded against the one thing it cannot tolerate: a single, defiant human spirit, choosing to walk its own path, even if that path leads into the cold, indifferent, and beautifully uncertain dark. For more stories that explore the complex shadows of our shared history, subscribe and join the conversation.